The park was Malik's sanctuary. He could sit in relative tranquility, his back against the rough bark of a large oak tree, while the world carried on without him. While a black homeless man, who rescues a white youngster from bullies, finds out who the boy's father is. Malik's eyes turned toward the playground, where a small boy, maybe 7 or 8, was surrounded by a group of ruffle-looking boys. The boy's face, pale with fear, clutched his backpack like it was the moment Malik could almost forget the weight of his world. Then he heard a sharp scream, followed by the cruel laughter of older kids. His instinct told him to stay out of it to avoid trouble. But then he saw the leader of the group, a tall youngster with a sneer plastered across his face. Only thing keeping him safe is stop the boy whimpering, his voice barely audible over the bully. Tueski's grip tightened around the worn fabric of his coat. Rich, the leader, Jared, kicked dirt at the boy's face. The others laughed, egging him on. Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that look in the bully's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror when he was a teenager, angry and lost. Pushed the smaller boy so hard, he stumbled and fell to the ground. From his post under the tree, he started walking toward the group. His steps were slow but deliberate. Each one echoed in his mind like a countdown. He called out, his voice firm but calm. The bullies didn't hear him at first, but caught up in their cruel game, I said, "Hey," the leader finally looked up, his expression from amusement to irritation. "What do you want, old man?" he sneered, trying to cover his surprise with bravado. "Leave him alone," Malik said, his eyes locked onto the bullies. He did not raise his voice, but there was an edge to his tone that made the other guys stop. "And who's going to make us one of the other guys?" Jared said. Took a step back, uncertain of the man standing before them. Meek answered. He simply stared at them, his gaze steady as if daring them to test him for a moment. There was silence, and in that silence, the leader seemed to realize this wasn't a fight worth picking. "Come on, let us go," the leader muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. Turned away, the others following. This youngster's not worth it. Malik watched them leave, his muscles tense until they were out of sight. Only then did he turn his attention to the youngster on the ground. "You all right, kid?" asked, his voice softening. Boy looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Where's your folks?" "My dad's coming to pick me up," Ethan said, his voice still shaky. "Malik." He nodded again, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Park," as if expecting the bullies to return at any moment. Malik looked around, noticing for the first time the costly clothes Ethan was wearing and the high-end backpack slung over his shoulder. This kid was from a different world, one far removed from Malik's reality. But in this moment, that didn't matter all right. Malik said, his voice steady and reassuring. "How about I wait with you until he gets here?" Ethan's eyes brightened at the offer, and he nodded eagerly. Malik led him over to the bench he had been sitting on earlier, and they sat down together, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. They didn't talk much after that. Malik sat silently watching the park entrance, half expecting trouble to find them again. Minutes passed, and finally a sleek black car pulled up at the park's edge. Ethan's face lit up and seemed to relax, just knowing someone was there, someone who wouldn't let the bullies hurt him again. His eyes immediately locked on Ethan. Dad, Ethan called, running over to him. The man's stern face softened as he caught sight of his son, and he knelt down to hug him. Malik stood as well, watching as a tall man in a sharp suit pointed back at Malik, who was now a few steps away, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Dad, this is Malik. He helped me when some kids were picking on me." James West, Ethan's father, stood up and looked at Malik. His expression hardened slightly. "Thank you for helping my son." His tone was polite but distant. James's response was not instantaneous. Instead, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and started guiding him toward the car we needed to get going. Ethan said goodbye. Ethan looked back at Malik, a little frown on his face. Malik said, "You take care," forcing a smile as they got into the car and drove off, leaving him alone once more in the park. Malik let out a long breath and turned back to his spot under the tree, pulling his coat tighter around him as the autumn wind began to pick up. The world moved on. Malik leaned back against the tree, closing his eyes. Tomorrow the struggle would continue. But at least for now, he had something to hold on to, a reminder that despite all he could still do some good in this world. Malik leaned back against the bench, his eyes half closed, as he listened to the rustle of leaves overhead. The adrenaline that had surged through him during the conference was fading, leaving behind a dull ache in his bones. He hadn't been in a fight, but the tension of the moment, the memories that dredged up, left him weary. He thought the lad would have left with. Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Could I sit with you?" his father asked without looking back. Instead, he felt a presence beside him, opening his eyes, a hesitant look on his face. "Should I be with you?" Ethan looked toward the park entrance. Malik nodded slowly. He wasn't used to people staying around after he had what he needed from him, but there was something in the boy's eyes, curiosity maybe, or gratitude, that kept Malik from brushing him off. He moved over on the bench, making room for Ethan. "Sure, kid," Malik said, patting the spot next him. "Take a seat." Ethan climbed onto the bench. His legs swung above the ground for a moment. They sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the gap between them. Malik was happy to let it be, but he could feel the youngster's eyes on him, as if Ethan was trying to figure out something he couldn't quite understand. "Why you helped me?" Ethan asked, suddenly breaking the silence. Malik didn't answer immediately. He wasn't used to explaining himself, especially not to a kid, but something about Ethan's earnestness made him consider the question seriously. Finally, his voice quiet, but firm. "No one should have to face that alone." Ethan frowned as if trying to understand. "But you don't even know?" Malik chuckled softly, the sound more of a breath than anything else. "Don't even mean you have to help someone. Sometimes it's enough just be there." His brows wrinkled in thought. Avoiding the question directly, "I'm around here a lot." Ethan didn't press further, but Malik could see the wheels turning in his young mind. There was a sharpness to the boy's gaze that reminded Malik of himself at that age. "Here?" he asked, looking around the park, as if expecting to find a hidden house among the trees. Ethan asked, surprising Malik again with his directness. "No, I don't," Malik said, shaking his head. "Never had a family like that." Ethan tilted his head, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Why not?" Malik hesitated, caught off guard by the innocent question. Malik said simply, hoping that would be enough. Ethan seemed to sense that this was a topic best left alone, and he nodded his attention. The decisions, the twists of fate had led him to this point. He did not want to burden the lad with his life story. A story filled with more downs than UPS. "Life simply did not turn out that way for me," Malik said. Ethan spoke once more, his voice a little softer. "Do you get lonely?" Mike blinked, startled by the question. Loneliness was something he had grown accustomed to, something he rarely acknowledged, even if it was like an old coat he wore. Shifting back to the park, they sat quietly for a few moments, daily frayed at the margins but familiar. Sometimes Malik admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "But you get used to it." Ethan didn't say anything right away. Instead, he pulled his bag onto his lap, fiddling with the zipper. "I get lonely too," he said. Finally, his voice so quiet, Mike looked at the lad, startled. Ethan had a father who obviously cared for him, a life that from the outside seemed full of everything a child could need. But loneliness didn't discriminate. It crept into the hearts of the rich and the poor alike. "Why do you feel lonely?" Malik asked gently, careful not to pry too. Malik nodded, understanding more than he let on. He knew what it was like to want someone's time and attention, only to find they were always out of reach. Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. "My dad's always busy. I don't get to see him much." Though Malik said, trying to offer some comfort, you could tell just by how he hurried over here when he knew you were in trouble. Ethan smiled faintly at that, though the sadness didn't completely leave his eyes. I know, but I wish he wasn't so busy all the time. Mick lacked a solution for that. Tell the child that things would magically get better, or that his dad would suddenly have more time. Life didn't work that way, and Malik wasn't one for giving false hope. Instead, he reached over and gently squeezed Ethan's shoulder. You're a strong kid. Don't forget that. Ethan looked up at Malik, her eyes wide. James West was walking back toward them, his phone in hand, the frown on his face softening when he pocketed it, and approached the bench, giving Malik a polite nod. Searching for a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something, but before he could, the sound of footsteps interrupted James West. James said, his tone still formal, but less distant than before, "No problem." Malik replied, standing up from the bench, "Just glad he's safe." James placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him off the bench. "We should get going." Ethan looked up at Malik, a question in his eyes, but whatever it was, he didn't ask it instead. He simply nodded, his little hand holding his father's bigger one. "Will I see you again?" Ethan said, his voice hopeful. Malik looked at James, who eyed him carefully before going back to Ethan. "Maybe you take care, all right, Ethan?" His heart a little lighter than it had been before as he walked away. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder and waved. Malik raised a hand in return, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Stay in the park until the sun sank below the horizon, the last traces. James West grabbed the first daylight, disappearing for the first time in a long time. Malik felt that the loneliness he carried was not as heavy as it usually was. He had made a connection, but brief, with someone who saw him. For now was enough. James stole a glance at his son through the rearview mirror, worry gnawing at him. Ethan had been quiet since they left the park, and James knew something was bothering him. His mind whirled as he navigated the city streets. Ethan sat unusually subdued, his small face pressed against the window. James had always been careful to keep a distance from shield Ethan from. His eyes tired and distant, James had seen people like him before, people living on the margins, forgotten by society, struggling just to survive. James couldn't shake the image of the man Malik who had been sitting with Ethan on that bench. His clothes were old and worn. That world, not because he lacked compassion, but because it was a world full of hazards he couldn't always predict or control. Yet today that very world had collided with his own, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. Dad, Ethan's voice broke the silence, pulling James from his thoughts. Ethan's voice was soft, tinged with disappointment. James took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to keep you waiting out there. I knew you had had a rough day." James responded, trying to sound as calm as possible. James's question hung in the air. The innocence behind it made James's chest tighten. "I know," James said, his tone gentler now, "and I am really grateful to him. Then why did you act like you did not want me to talk to him?" Though the world was not black and white, he knew the instinct of a father was to protect, even if that meant erring on the side of caution. "Ethan, sometimes people we do not know may have their own problems." James started carefully. "It is not that they are bad, but rather we have to be clear about his concerns to his son." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Ethan was a smart kid, too smart. Sometimes it's not always about what people say. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing his father's words. "You didn't even talk to him. How do you know he has problems?" "It's about what you can see, Malik. Well, I just want to make sure you're safe," but he was safe. Ethan insisted, a hint of frustration in his voice. "He was the only one who helped me when those lads were being nasty. He didn't even ask for anything, he just wanted to help." James frowned, his grip tightening on the wheel. Ethan's words echoed in his mind. It was true. Malik hadn't asked for anything, hadn't shown any sign of ulterior motives, but James couldn't shake the unease that lingered, the protective instinct that flared, whenever Ethan was involved. Pulled up to their house, a large modern structure in. James said gently, "I'm not saying Malik is a bad person, rather a quiet, upscale neighborhood where the driveway was lined with neatly trimmed hedges and the porch lights flickered on as they approached James, parked the car, and turned to face Ethan, who was still staring out the window. Ethan finally glanced at his father, his eyes searching James's face. "You're always working, Dad. You're not here a lot. But today Malik was there." The words struck James like a punch to the who just needs some assistance. James took a deep breath, his resolve wavering. He knew Ethan missed him. He knew his demanding profession frequently kept him away from home more than he would have liked, but hearing it from his kid so clearly and without accusation made it all the more heartbreaking. "I know, buddy, and I'm sorry for that." James wasn't sure how to react. On one hand, he wanted to respect Ethan's feelings. Malik had, after all, been there when his son needed help. On the other, James's instincts screamed at him to keep Ethan away from any. Ethan nodded more okay. James said, not wanting to make a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, "Let's get inside and have some dinner, all right?" Ethan nodded again, his shoulders slumping slightly as he got out of the car. James followed his thoughts heavy. Usually the warmth and comfort of home brought him some measure of peace. But tonight, the disquiet stayed. Supper was quiet, the normal talk replaced by a thoughtful stillness. Ethan nibbled at his meal, his mind plainly elsewhere. James attempted to engage him in conversation, but the boy's replies were brief. Malik. In the events of the day after dinner, Ethan went to his room, leaving James alone at the kitchen table. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty plate in front of him. His mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. Grateful for Malik, for shielding Ethan. Worry about the man's intentions and guilt over how he had handled the situation. He couldn't overlook the fact Malik had done something he hadn't been able to do. Be there for Ethan when he needed someone. James's protectiveness, his need to control the situation, had eclipsed his gratitude, and now he was left wondering if he had made the right call. James pushed back from the table and walked into his study. His work was his life. He was good at it, respected, but it had also cost him time with his son, time he could not get back. He sat down at the desk, opening one of the files, but the words blurred before his eyes. Ethan's face, his. James closed the file and leaned back in his chair, knowing he couldn't solve everything with work, and he couldn't shield Ethan from every hurt, but he could try to understand, to be there for his son in a way that didn't always come naturally to him, and maybe his yearning for something James couldn't always provide. With a sigh, James mentally noted to visit the park once more, this time with an open mind. Perhaps Meek wasn't just a man in need, but someone who could teach them both something about kindness, about being. Malik had a real chance to prove that his intentions were as good as they seemed. James could hear the birds tweeting outside as he sat at the kitchen table. Present in a world often pulling him in different directions, the thought was disturbing, but it was also strangely comforting. For now, it was enough to know that he could try. The following Saturday dawned with a clear blue sky, the kind of morning that seemed to beg for an outing. James could hear Ethan was upstairs, still getting ready today. They were returning to the park James had wrestled with. His initial reluctance to bring Ethan back to possibly encounter Malik had progressively given way to a sense of responsibility. Ethan had been right. Ethan was staring deep into his coffee cup. Malik had been there for him when it mattered. The least James could do was give the man a fair chance. He wasn't sure what he would say to Malik if they saw him. The man had saved his son from harm, a debt James felt keenly, but there was also a weariness that he couldn't completely shake. James had built his life on carefully managing risks, whether in the courtroom or in his personal life. But today, he was stepping outside that comfort zone, driven by a mix of thanks and the need to set an example for his son, Dad. Ethan's voice broke through James's wry. The boy stood at the foot of the stairs, his face lit up with anticipation. James managed to smile, pushing his doubts to the back of his mind, already sporting his preferred baseball cap, his small backpack slung over one shoulder. Yes, we're going. Let's start before it gets too hot. The drive to the park was quiet, but not the tense silence that had filled the car earlier in the week. Ethan was humming softly to himself. James concentrated on the road. His mind was turning over what he might say if they ran across Malik when they arrived. The park was already bustling with activity. Families were out for walks. Kids were running around the playground and joggers were making their rounds. James scanned the area as they walked in his eyes. His enthusiasm was evident. Ethan asked, his voice hopeful. James hesitated, not wanting to get Ethan's hopes up. Maybe we would see. They wandered through the park, passing by the spot where Ethan had been bullied. James felt a pang of guilt as he instinctively sought for the familiar figure he had seen just days before. Remembered how fast he had wanted to leave that day, to distance Ethan from the whole situation, but saw the park now full of life and energy. He understood why Ethan had wanted to come back. There was something comforting about the familiarity of the place, even with the memories of what had happened as they rounded a corner near a cluster. James noticed Malik seated on a bench. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes watched warily. He wore the same clothes as before, a well-worn jacket over a faded shirt, but there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there in their first encounter. His gaze focused on something in. Malik called, breaking into a run toward the bench. Malik looked up, surprise flickering across his face, followed by a smile that softened his features. He stood up as Ethan approached, crouching down to meet the boy at eye level. Ethan laughed, his face lighting up. "We came back to see you, right?" Dad James, who had been walking a few paces behind, caught up to them. He nodded, feeling little uneasy, but determined to push through it. "Yes." His voice was warm. James nodded slightly. "Sure, if you wanted." Malik's smile returned, this time more real. "But I warn you, I'm not as fast as I used to be." Ethan laughed, already pulling a small baseball out of his backpack. He handed it to Malik, then running a few steps away. James's excitement infectious. Watched as Malik and Ethan started to toss the ball back and forth, their laughter mixing with the sounds of the park. He stayed on the sidelines first, observing the way Malik interacted with his son. There was an ease to it, a natural rapport that James could not help but admire. Malik was patient, encouraging. James caught the ball, startled by the invitation. He hadn't. Never letting the ball stay on the ground for long, he treated Ethan not just with kindness, but with a respect James found himself appreciating more with each passing moment. Malik called out to James after a while, tossing the ball to him with a grin. Expected to be included soon, but the real tone in Malik's voice made it abundantly evident that the offer was sincere. With a smile, James entered the game, throwing the ball back to Ethan, who caught it with a triumphant shout. The three of them played together, the tension that had lingered between James and Malik slowly dissolving as the game went on. There were no deep talks, no probing inquiries, just the simple shared joy of a game of catch. As James felt himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in a long time, he was accustomed to be in charge, to analyze every scenario from every perspective. Yet here, under the warm sun, his son's laughter filling the air, he let go of that need, if only temporarily realized that Malik was a man with his own story, and perhaps his own need for connection. After about an hour, they finally called it a day. All of them. A little winded, but James could see how much this moment meant to him, how much he had needed it. "Thanks for playing with us," Ethan said as they walked back toward the park entrance. "Anytime, kid," Malik replied. Ruffling Ethan's hair, turned to James. Ethan was flushed with happiness, his earlier reticence totally gone. "I'm the one should be thanking you for what you did for Ethan. I wasn't sure at first, but I can see now that you're a good man." Malik smiled, a faint trace of sadness in his eyes. "I have made." His tone was changing. "Mr. West." James considered that feeling a pang of awareness. Everyone had their own battles, their own regrets. Malik's journey had clearly been a difficult one, but it was one he was still walking, still trying to find his way. "Maybe we could help each other," James said the offer. "Coming from a place he hadn't expected, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Meek looked startled, but there was gratitude in his eyes. "I appreciate that more than you know." They exchanged a look, a mutual understanding passing between them. It wasn't the start of a friendship, but rather it was the... James felt peace settle over him. The worries that had dogged him earlier were still there, but they were muted now, overshadowed by something a bridge between two rather different lives as they parted ways with Ethan. James felt a sense of pride that warmed him from the inside out as they drove home with Ethan. Malik had shielded his son when he couldn't, and now in some little way James had returned that kindness. But more than that, he had shown Ethan what it meant to trust, to give people a chance even when it wasn't easy. And for that, James felt. James realized today had been more than just a trip back to the park. It had been a step forward for all of them. The next weekend arrived faster than James had anticipated. He found himself looking forward to it, even though he wouldn't have openly admitted that out loud. The past week had been busy with work, the usual grind of cases and court visits. But in the quiet moments between his ideas, often drifted back to that day in the park. More specifically, to Malik, James had always pressed himself on his ability to read people in his line of work. It was a skill that often meant the difference between winning and losing a case. Malik had thrown him off balance. There was something about the man James usually used to classify people. Mick had saved his son, yes, but there was more to him, layers James could not quite see yet, but wanted to understand, mixed with a curiosity, mixed with a growing respect. James packed a little cooler with sandwiches and drinks, a gesture that felt both casual and important. Ethan was all too eager, practically bouncing with excitement at the idea, and so with a sense of purpose that surprised even himself. James arrived at the park. The day was sunny, but a light breeze kept the heat at bay. Families were out enjoying the sun, children's laughter echoing through the trees as they walked towards the familiar bench. James spotted Malik seated in the same place as before. His posture relaxed, but his gaze thoughtful. "Dad there." Ethan's voice broke through James's thoughts, and before he could reply, the lad was already running ahead. Malik looked up, a smile breaking across his face as he saw Ethan approaching. He stood to greet the boy, couching down to give him a high five. By the time James caught up, the two were already deep in conversation. "Ethan." He approached James Malik, straightening up. There was a certain warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before, a familiarity that made the greeting seem more real. James indicated to the cooler he was carrying enthusiastically, retelling his time at school. He nodded. James spread out a blanket and they all settled down, Ethan digging into his sandwich with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Malik's eyes flickered with surprise, but he quickly nodded. I would want that they found a spot under a big oak tree, the shade providing a welcome respite from the sun. James spread out. James decided to approach the topic that had been on his mind all week. Malik, James started his tone, careful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said last. A while the three of them ate, in companionable silence, the quiet, punctuated by Ethan's comments about school or the park. Time about making up for errors. Malik's demeanor changed, the easy grin fading somewhat as a more guarded look took place. He sat down his water bottle, his hands resting in his lap. Okay. James noted, selecting his words carefully. I don't want to pry, but James worried that he had overstepped, pushed too hard. But then Malik sighed, a deep, weary sound, and when he spoke, his voice was low almost. Think it might help if you talked about it sometimes. Sharing your story could be a way forward. James nodded, his expression encouraging. I have time. Ethan sensed the change in the conversation, looked between the two men. It is a sad story. Malik smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Yeah, kid, it is a sad one. James placed a reassuring, as if he was speaking to himself, hand on Ethan's shoulder, then turned his attention back to Malik. We're listening. Malik was silent for a few moments, gathering his thoughts when he finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was undercurrent of emotion James had not heard before. I was not always like this. Malik started gesturing vaguely too. I had a nice life, at least by most measures. Grew up in a respectable area, went to school, had a job. I worked as a mechanic for years, enjoyed it too. There's something honest about working with your hands, mending things. His old clothing and weary demeanor. James listened attentively as Malik continued. Life doesn't always go the way you intend. I got involved up with the wrong set, old pals largely. Ed began consuming drugs to take the edge off at first. It was darkening, just a means of relaxation. Before I knew it, I was lost in my house. Everything he stopped swallowing hard. I attempted to become clean more than time, but it's not simple when you have no support. Finally, James felt a tightness in his chest as he listened, the weight of Malik's words heavy in the air. What happened then? James asked silently. Malik shrugged. The gesture was far from casual. The gravity of the story not lost on him. I used to fix things for a living, but I couldn't fix my own life. I was angry for a long time at the world, but that kind of anger eats away at you. He looked down at his hands, the calluses and scars a testament to the life he lived. James felt a surge of empathy for the man seated across from him. Malik's story was one of loss and struggle, but it was also one of resilience he had gone through, though he was still standing the road. I had been clean for a while now, but it's not easy every day. Had taken its toll. You're here. James said, his voice firm. And that counts for something. You saved my son, Malik. That means you're worth something. Malik looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief. Hope. I don't know if I believe, he admitted. Ethan had been listening quietly until he spoke suddenly. There was a moment of silence, as they all absorbed the weight of what had been shared. James could see the toll Malik's past had taken on him, the way it had softened his expression and reached out to ruffle Ethan's hair. Malik is a good man. James cleared his voice steady. Malik, I want to help, but I'm not sure exactly how yet. He had shaped the man he was today, but also saw something else, a will to keep going, to try and make things right, even if it seemed impossible. James looked at him, some surprise flickering across. James responded firmly, I believe in second chances, and because you have shown me that you deserve one. Malik was quiet for a long moment's eyes, searching James's face as if trying to find some hidden motive. James, the word made peace with where I am now. Not doing it out of pity, James replied. James smiled, a sense of purpose settling over him. We will figure it out one step at a time. As they packed and ready to leave the park, all he found was sincerity. It was that sincerity that finally broke through the walls he had built around himself. I'm not sure where to start. James felt as though they were on the correct path. Ethan walked between them, holding Malik's hand on one side and James's on the other. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park, but the warmth felt far from over, and there were still battles to be fought. Monday morning came with its usual bustle, and James couldn't help but believe that in some little way they were all starting to heal, and maybe this was the beginning of something new for all of them. Monday morning persisted. James felt it would be a good fit for Malik, given his background in mechanics. He had an extra layer of expectation and had managed to set Malik a job interview at a local auto repair shop, a reputable one known for its quality work and community involvement. James drove Ethan to school and looked at James asked, trying to break the silence. Ethan shrugged, not meeting his father's. Yeah, I guess James could tell there was more on Ethan's mind. He still had some time before the interview. Ethan was unusually quiet, his usual chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence, excited for school today. James smiled. feeling a surge of pride at Ethan's empathy. "I just hope Malik gets the job. He's really nice, Dad. I want him to be happy." "Dad, I want him to be happy. We'll do everything we can to help him." Ethan nodded his face. James's thoughts turned to Malik. He hoped the interview would go well, but he knew there were challenges ahead. His past would most likely come up, and James wasn't sure. Dad arrived at the school, and James gave Ethan a quick hug before watching him head inside as he drove away. James arrived early to ensure everything was set up. The shop was a busy place with mechanics working on cars in various stages of repair. The smell of motor oil and gasoline filled the air, mixing with the sounds of tools clanking and engines rumbling. The shop owner, a burly man. Rick was known for his gruff appearance, but had a reputation for being fair and giving people a chance. "James," Rick said, wiping his hands on a rag, "you ready for this?" James nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. Rick glanced at the clock. Got a few. James followed Rick through the shop, observing the orderly chaos. The place was clean and well-maintained, with various tools and equipment neatly arranged. Rick explained the shop's operations, his pride in his work evident. "So what's the story with this Malik guy?" Rick asked as they walked. James took a minute. Deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Malik's had a rough time recently, but he's got experience in mechanics. I think he's worth giving a chance." Rick nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Everyone's got a past, James. It's what they do with it that counts." Before James could respond, the door to the shop opened, and Malik entered. He looked nervous. His clothes were clean but still worn. He carried a little duffel bag slung over one shoulder as he approached. James could see the mix of determination and anxiety on his face. He returned the smile, though it was hesitant. "James," Rick said. Leading Malik to a small office at the rear of the shop, Rick said, "Let's get started," Rick said. James, Rick stepped forward, extending a hand. "Rick, glad you could make ready for the interview." Malik shook Rick's hand, nodding. "Yes, sir. Ready as I'll ever be, great." Rick closed the door behind. James listened through the thin walls, catching snippets of Malik's answers. Malik spoke about his previous work, his skills in repairing various types of vehicles, and his commitment to getting clean. His voice was steady, though there were standard questions about Malik's experience and skills. Was a margin of doubt, James could hear. After some time, the office door opened and Malik emerged, his face a mask of nervous expectation. Rick followed him, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming in," Malik, Rick said, offering a firm handshake. "We will be in touch soon." Malik took the handshake with a nod then. "I think it went well," James said, trying to sound positive. Rick seemed interested. Malik managed a little hopeful smile. "I hope so." They left the shop together. Malik stepped slow and thoughtful. James could sense the weight of the moment, the hope and uncertainty. Turned to James. "How'd it go?" James could see the anxiety in Malik's eyes, the way he was holding himself. That Malik carried with him. "Do you want to grab a coffee or something?" James offered, wanting to encourage Malik. Malik shook his head, though he looked grateful. "I think I just need some time to think." James nodded. "Understanding, all right. We are in this together." "I appreciate that, thanks, James." As Malik walked away, James watched him go, feeling a pang of empathy. He knew that the outcome of the interview was still uncertain, but he valued Malik's bravery and will. James drove home, this day's events weighing heavily on his mind. He hoped Malik would get the job that would be the break he needed to start over. But beyond that, James hoped Malik would find a sense of purpose and belonging, something missing for a long time. When he arrived home, Ethan was already back from school, his face brilliant with excitement. "How did it go?" "Malik got the job." James sat down beside him. His smile reassured us. "We don't know yet. Rick said he would be in touch soon." Ethan's face fell slightly, but he tried to stay optimistic. "I hope he gets it." He really deserves a chance. James wrapped an arm around Ethan, feeling a sense of pride in his unwavering support for Malik. James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Helping Malik was more than just a favor. It was a chance to make a difference, to offer support and understanding in a world. "So do I, buddy." James found himself reflecting on the events of the day as he prepared for bed. The atmosphere in the house warm and comforting. That often lacked both. And as he closed his eyes, he hoped Malik would find the chance he needed to rebuild his life, and that in some tiny way, he had helped that journey. Wednesday dawned with a light drizzle, the kind that turned the city streets slick and shiny. James had just finished morning ritual and was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when his phone buzzed on the countertop. The screen flashed Rick's name. His heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this call. He took a deep breath and answered. James West. "Hey, James." Rick's voice came through steady, and no echoes. "Got a moment to talk?" Of course, James responded. "I wanted to let you know we're offering Malik the job. Rick said he starts on Monday." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's great news." "Thank you, Rick." "No problem. Malik has skills. He needs a shot, and I think he would work out. Keep your tone casual." James leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Malik had done. He had gotten the job. James knew it was just the beginning of Malik's journey. But it was a major step forward. He couldn't wait to share with Malik quickly. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. It was still drizzling outside. James hardly noticed the temperature as he headed to the park. The park was quieter than usual, the rain keeping most people indoors. James scanned the area and spotted Malik seated on their regular bench. His posture relaxed, but his eyes focused on the ground. James called out as he, "Good news." I hope James nodded, his excitement barely contained. "Rick called you start on Monday." Malik's eyes widened, and for a moment he was silent. Then a broad smile broke across his face, a smile full of relief and joy. Malik looked up, his expression unreadable. "This is your chance to get back on your feet." Malik let a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you, James. I didn't know what to expect. I was afraid I could have messed it off." "James," I assured him, "you were honest in this." James nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "I am glad, and remember, if you need anything, just let me know. This is a new beginning for you." As they walked together, Malik seemed lighter. "You showed them what you could do, and this is what counts." James could see how much the job offer meant to Malik. It was like a beacon of hope in a long, dark tunnel. More relaxed, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The colors of the park seemed more vivid against the gray sky James could see. James asked anyone else how it was like. "I wanted to wait till I knew for sure." James nodded, understanding well. "I'm sure Ethan will be happy to hear the news." They reached the playground just as Ethan was racing towards them, his face sparkling with interest. "What's going on? Did Mick get the job?" James laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair. Laughed the sound rich with real happiness. "Thanks, kid. I hope so." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the park, the conversation flowing easily. Malik and Ethan played on the swings. "Did Mick starts on Monday?" Ethan's face lit up with excitement. From school to the new job, James watched them with a feeling of contentment, seeing how much Malik's presence had already begun to positively impact Ethan's life as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. James felt a great sense of accomplishment. Malik's new job was more than just a. When it was time to leave, Malik walked with James and Ethan to their car. He turned to James, his expression serious but hopeful. This was a chance for a fresh start, a way to rebuild and find a new sense of purpose. "I cannot thank you enough, James. It means a lot." James placed. Malik nodded, his eyes full of gratitude. "I will, and I won't forget this." As they said their goodbyes, James felt a renewed sense of optimism. The road ahead for Malik was still uncertain, but the offer of a job was a significant, comforting hand on Malik's shoulder. "You earned Driving home, Ethan chattered excitedly about Malik's new job. His enthusiasm contagious. James listened, feeling a great sense of satisfaction he had helped someone in need, and in doing so had made a positive change in his life. Turning point, it was a chance to prove himself, to find stability, and to make a good change in his life. James looked at his son, feeling appreciative of the link they had and the chance to help others. The future was always uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of promise and hope. As the car pulled into the driveway, the evening settled over their neighborhood. James could tell Malik had been up early. Malik's excitement was evident, but so was his anxiety. James had offered to drive Malik to the shop, a gesture of support that Malik had gratefully accepted. James and Malik were in the car. Malik sat in the passenger seat, his hands gripping the edge of his jacket, his eyes fixed on the passing streets. "You ready for this?" James asked, trying to sound casual. Looking over his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Yeah, nervous but ready. Thank you for the trip. I know it's just a tiny thing, but it means a lot. Haven't done this in a long." James nodded. "It's natural to be worried, but you have the abilities, so concentrate on showing them what you can do." Malik managed a little grin, though it was tinged with anxiety. "Thank you." They pulled into the parking lot of the auto repair shop. James could see the hustle and bustle of the morning shift already in full swing. Mechanics were moving in and out, tools were clinking, and the smell of motor oil and gasoline hung in the air. James parked the car and turned to Malik. "This is least I could do." "I'll see you absolutely," James said, giving him a comforting pat on the shoulder. "Remember, take it one step at a time." Malik stepped out of the car and made his way toward the shop. His heart filled. James knew it was only the beginning of what would be a difficult but rewarding journey. As he drove home, his thoughts turned to Ethan, who was eagerly waiting for news about Malik's first day when he arrived. Ethan was already at the door, her face brilliant with curiosity. How did it go? With hope and encouragement, it was a big day for Malik and James. Malik's first day went great. He was nervous but got the cook. That's a big step. Ethan's face lit with excitement. "That's awesome. I'm really happy for him." James ruffled Ethan's hair, feeling a surge of pride in his son's positive. Ethan asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Attitude, me too. Buddy Malik's got a chance to turn things around, and it's thanks everyone who believed in him." The day passed in a routine of work and chores. But James found himself regularly checking his phone, hoping for a message or call from Malik. Late afternoon, as he was finishing up some work at home, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Malik's first day went well, and that was a good indication. When Ethan came home from school, he was bubbling with questions. How was Malik doing? Malik first day went well, tired but felt good, thanks for everything, James read. James nodded, showing Ethan the text message he mentioned. It went well. He's tired, but he's feeling great about it. Ethan grinned, and that's fantastic. I can't wait to see him again later that evening. As James and Ethan were having dinner, the doorbell rang. James answered, finding Malik standing on the porch. Expression tired but happy. Malik James greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. How was your first day? Was it good? Busy but good. Everyone was welcoming. I think I would fit in well here. Ethan came running up to greet Malik, his excitement evident. Malik laughed, the sound real and light. Yes, I did. I worked on a couple of engines and did some routine maintenance. It felt good to be back in the shop. James noticed the difference in Malik's attitude. The nervousness that had been there before was replaced with a quiet confidence. James and Malik discussed the day. Malik shared little anecdotes, not and details about his work. The conversation was easy, and it was clear that Malik was beginning to feel more at ease in his job than just a way to make money. Malik was reclaiming a part of him. James and Malik helped Ethan with his homework. Malik gave some advice and encouragement as Ethan worked through his math problems. The evening passed in a comfortable rhythm, a mix of laughter and conversation that made it abundantly evident how much Malik's presence had already begun to positively impact their lives when James felt a great sense of satisfaction. Malik's first day had gone. The positive change was already clear. It was not only about the job it was about the hope and new beginning that came with it. James and Ethan settled down for the evening. James could not help but think on how. James felt a sense of fulfillment. Helping Malik had been more than just a gesture of kindness. Far Malik had come in such a short time, the road ahead would still have challenges. Malik was on a path to rebuild his life one step at a time, and as he tucked Ethan into bed, James felt a sense of fulfillment supporting someone in their life. James kissed Ethan goodnight, turned off the light feeling. A renewed sense of hope for the days ahead. The future was always uncertain, but with each new step, it felt a little brighter. The first few weeks of Malik's new job were filled with a whirl of activity. Mornings began early with Malik arriving at the shop before the official start of the workday, eager to get a head start. By now he had settled into a routine, but the weight of his past still lingered, and each day was a balancing act between the new stability and old insecurities James noticed one evening as they were finishing dinner. Malik looked up, his expression momentarily guarded before he forced a smile. Yeah, just a long day. Malik seemed far, his focus drifting. Ethan was recounting a story from school. Malik was only half listening, his mind clearly elsewhere. Nothing to worry about James. He let it slide. He could tell Malik was trying to manage things on his own, perhaps not wanting to burden others with his problems. It was not unusual for people in Malik's circumstances, a struggle in silence. The next morning, James was heading to the office. James paused for a moment before approaching Malik. Morning. Malik. James greeted, trying to keep his tone light. Everything all right? Malik looked up, a flutter of surprise crossing his face. Oh, hey, James, yeah. Just a bit of a rough start this morning. Got a few issues I'm trying to sort out. James nodded, sensing that Malik's problems went beyond just a rough start. Anything I can help with? Malik hesitated, then shook his head. No, it's just some financial stuff. I have a few bills piling up, and it has been a bit overwhelming. James listened, feeling a pang of empathy. That strain could add to the pressure of trying to rebuild one's life. If you need any help or advice, I'm here. Sometimes just talking things out can make a difference. Malik appreciated the offer, but was clearly reluctant to accept it. Thanks, James. I'll manage. I don't want to put you out. James put a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. It's no trouble, James knew that the pressure of his new job combined with financial concerns was a heavy burden. He was clearly trying hard to keep his life on track, but the struggle was obvious. Later that day, James was in his office when he could not shake the concern he felt for Malik. James, I'm going to have to change my schedule a little. Things have been a bit hectic at work, and I have some personal stuff to sort out. Malik called, and the tone of the conversation was professional, but James could sense an underlying tension in Malik's voice. James wanted to offer more help, but was aware of Malik's pride. All right. Let me know if you need anything. We are here to support you. After the call, James spent the rest of the day thinking. Just juggling a lot right now. I will manage, but could need some time to get things sorted. Regarding Malik, he knew that supporting him without crossing boundaries was delicate. Malik was obviously struggling with more than just the demands of a new job. The weight of past mistakes and current financial pressures was showing signs in the evening. James decided to visit Malik's apartment, hoping to provide some useful advice. I just wanted to check in, James said, stepping inside. How are things really going? Malik sighed, a hint of relief in his eyes. It's been tough. Help. He knocked on the door, and Malik answered, looking surprised but delighted to see him. Hey, James, what's up? James sat at the little dining table and noticed the stack of unopened bills and documentation. I know it's not easy, so maybe we could go through some of this together. I could be able to help you find some resources or advice. Malik looked at his shoulder. Works have been demanding. Although I wanted to keep it under wraps, slumping slightly, it has been overwhelming as they worked through the paperwork. James provided practical advice and solutions, helping Malik understand his options. They spent the evening discussing budgeting, potential assistance programs, and ways to manage his finances more effectively. Thank James. I didn't realize how much I needed this. James nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. No problem. You have been doing a great job, and sometimes everyone needs a little help. As James left Malik's apartment, Malik looked obviously relieved, a burden lifted from his shoulders. Helping Malik through these difficulties was more than just a kind deed. It was a means of rebuilding his life step by step. The struggle was real, but so was the support of friends and community back home. Ethan was already asleep, dreams bursting with the excitement of Malik's new employment and their developing friendship. James reflected. James settled into his own evening routine, feeling a mix of tiredness and satisfaction. The road ahead for Malik was still fraught with challenges, but James was committed to being there every step of the way. It was about more. Malik had already achieved, and how important it was to continue offering support during this vital time. James turned off the lights and headed to bed. He felt a quiet confidence that despite the challenges, things were moving in a positive direction. With each little step, Malik was moving closer to overcoming his past and finding a new life. It was more than just a job. It was about offering a lifeline and being part of Malik's journey towards a brighter future. Sense of stability and hope. The days had begun to stretch into a rhythm of early mornings and long hours. From Malik, his dedication to the job was obvious, but so was the weariness that came with it, despite the financial strain and the emotional toll of rebuilding his life. Malik had begun to find a new sense of purpose in his work, but it was clear. One Friday evening, James and Ethan decided to visit Malik's apartment. With a small gesture of encouragement, Ethan had been eager to share a drawing he had made at school, and James thought it would be a good way to lift Malik's spirits. He was still battling the shadows of his past, which lingered even in moments of progress. Malik opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of James and Ethan. "Hey, James, Ethan. What brings you here?" Ethan held up the drawing with a proud smile. "I made this at school." As Malik was finishing up a late shift, the faint hum of car engines in the distant city sounds, filling the air. "This is fantastic, Ethan. Thanks, it's great to have a reminder of the park." James noticed the slight relaxation in Malik's posture as he admired the drawing. The park where we play wanted to be given to Malik. His eyes softened. Malik sighed, the weight of tiredness evident. "It's been busy but manageable. I am still adjusting to the pace, but it is getting better." Ethan wandered around the small apartment, taking in the details of Malik's new life. "Do you have any plans for the weekend?" Malik shook his head. "Not really. I was thinking of catching up on some rest and maybe." James nodded, sensing Malik's need for a break. "How about we help you out? We could spend some time organizing and maybe even grab a meal afterward. It's important to take some time for yourself." Malik looked at them, a mix of gratitude and hesitation in his eyes. Although tired, Malik seemed to enjoy the company and the diversion from his daily concerns as they worked. James struck up a conversation with Malik. "I had a chance to just relax." They spent the next few hours cleaning and organizing Malik's apartment. Ethan eagerly helped sorting through items and placing them in neat piles. "Malik, it's not only about the job, it's about rebuilding your life. You're doing great." Malik looked around his apartment, taking in the orderly space and the warmth of the evening. "It feels good to have a bit of organization. It's been tough, but I'm starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel." James could see. Malik nodded, his thoughtful. "I've been trying to handle everything on my own, but I realize now that sometimes it's the little victories that make the biggest difference." Malik's attitude, the weight of his past, was still there, but it was beginning to lift. That seeking assistance is not a sign of weakness. Rather, It is part of moving forward. As the evening drew to a close, Malik decided to go out for dinner. Malik chose a small, cozy diner nearby, a place he had recently discovered over burgers and fries. The conversation flowed easily, and the atmosphere was light and relaxed. Ethan spoke about school and his. Malik seemed more at ease, his laughter more real, his demeanor more relaxed. It was obvious that the support and company were helping him negotiate the complexity of his new life. After dinner, they walked back to. Malik and James discussed work life and everything in between. Malik's apartment, where James and Ethan said their farewells, Malik stood in the doorway with a real smile on his face. Thanks for today. Anytime we are all in this together, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. I will not forget. James glanced over, curious. What's on your mind, buddy? Ethan turned to his dad, a thoughtful expression on his face. I think Malik's really starting to be happy again. She seems different, like he's finding his way. James smiled, touched by his son's insight. Yes, it's a journey, but he's making progress, and your drawing made a big difference too. Ethan, beaming, proud of his contribution. I'm glad. I want him to be happy back at home. James thought on the events of the day. Malik was finding a new perspective, and though the road ahead was still, James knew Malik's journey was far from over, but the encouraging friends and the little steps forward were really changing things. It was not only about finding a job or handling money, but also about rebuilding confidence, finding joy, and James told Ethan goodnight and snuggled him into bed, so embracing a fresh start and experiencing a strong feeling of. Although Malik's needs had been much sought after, it was obvious that though the future remained unknown, effort was paying off. Malik's every action it seemed a bit brighter. James switched out the light and walked to his own bed, feeling renewed sense of. Though the road was long, the good developments were evidence of the strength of support, friendship, and the resiliency of the human spirit. It seemed a bit brighter. James switched off the light and walked to. His own room is rejuvenated with a renewed sense of hope for a continuing trip. But the good developments were evidence of the strength of friendship and the resiliency of the human nature, human dignity.